Hey everyone, so in this video we want to look at how to constantly emit new objects into our simulation. So far we only looked at how to take objects and then simulate them, but now we want to constantly add new ones. And it's actually quite simple, so I prepared here a little rock, and let's for now first put this into an RBD bullet solver. Let's activate the ground plane and let's double check if everything works so far. Yeah, looks good for now, all right. So now we want to make sure that there's constantly a new rock coming into our simulation. It's actually quite simple to do that, and that is under setup. There is a checkbox here, emit RBDs. Unfortunately, what happens now is it does what it's supposed to do. It adds constantly new rocks into our system, but it's not what we expected because currently the rocks come in every single frame. Now, small note here, you would expect that this collision will create problems, but thankfully Bullet is clever enough to realize when there is a collision at the spawning or at the beginning of the simulation even, then the collision will not be triggered. Otherwise, this would basically explode. So this is good, but at the very least, you know, it doesn't look very nice. It's certainly not what we expected. So how can we solve this? There are basically two approaches that I regularly use. And the first one is to just make sure that when we spawn a new rock, that it will not spawn always at the same point. There are different ways of doing this, but one is to, for example, use something like a grid here and then copy the rocks onto it and then make sure that they are spawned at a different place every single time. And you probably already know how to do this. We just use a scatter node for this. And for now, we just set the total count to 3. And of course, what would happen if we now copy our rock to this with a copy to points, of course. And while we're here, let's make sure we pack and instance the whole thing. So let's delete the transform. We don't need that anymore. And now when we press start, of course, we just have, you know, the same thing 3 times, because of course what we want is you want to change the scatter position of my points every frame, and we know how to do this. We just change our global seed, and here we just put in, for example, $FF. So every frame, every subframe even, we will get a new position. So this then looks like this, and if we run this now, you can imagine the rock will be at a different place every frame, and it looks like this. And there you go, the problem is basically solved. I kind of did that in a nicer version by creating some kind of avalanche, but it's basically the same thing. So what I did here is I took a normal rock, nothing special, and then I copied it not to a full grid hanging in the air, but just a thin slice so that they all come from one certain area. Then I scatter onto it, of course, with a $FF in the seed. And to add a little bit more variation to it, I also randomized the p-scale and the orient so that the sources look like this, different orientation, different p-scale. Then I add a little bit of a velocity to it, and then the whole thing looks like this. And they currently fall into the ground, but what I wanted to add is a grid to add a little bit of, with a mountain node, to add a little bit of some kind of mountain. And what I want to use here is a height field. So let's quickly create a height field with similar size, because it's of course way too big. So let's put this to maybe 6 by 6 meters, which should match. Make sure that we lower the grid spacing already, and then we project that height field. And yeah, and we should get a representation of our mountain. Let's give it a bit more resolution, maybe something like this. And then we use that in our RBD bullet solver as a height field. And yeah, okay, let's make it clean. We use a null out height field. And let's use this as an input. And now we can see we have an actual avalanche that's, you know, rolling down a hill. Just for fun, let's make it a bit more interesting by adding some color to the rocks. Set it to random. And let's have a look at this again. And then, okay, there's a small problem here. Since we constantly only have 2 different points per frame, the color node will always come up with the same 2 colors. So let's make sure that we add a $FF to the seed here as well, so that we get different colors every frame. Of course, an attribute adjust color would have worked here as well, so that you have more control over the colors. But, you know, I just wanted to show you what you can do. And now we can see we have a nice funky colored avalanche setup. Okay, so varying the starting position of our objects is one way of avoiding collisions at the beginning, but there's another way, and that is making sure that we don't emit actually every single frame. And for this we can use a technique we've already seen, the modulo technique. So we take our object, for example, a little toy here, and what we want is to only spawn it every couple of frames. So let's put this into an RBD bullet solver first. Let's activate our ground plane, and let's double check if everything works. Yep, seems to work. Let's not talk about, the collision objects and all that. This is fine. Let's activate the emit RBDs. Of course, what then happens is that we get a new toy every single frame, which is not what we want. And to solve this, we can now use a switch node. And I'll link to you the modulo video where you can see this technique again if you forgot how to do it. But the idea is to just put a null into a switch together with our source. And then we use the expression $f modulo and then the number we want to spawn, so maybe every 12th frame. And we then compare this whole thing with 0. So only every 12th frame, this should give the result of 1. So let's go through this with the arrow keys. And here let's look through the switch. That's a bit quicker. And you can see, yeah, it is actually happening every 12th frame. Problem is, yeah, there it is. So there's a case like that. But unfortunately, we have the order wrong. So every 12th frame, our object will not be spawned. So let's make sure that we change the order so that it's the other way around. Yeah, okay. Only every 12th frame, we will see our toy. Okay, and now this should work. And now you can see what happens. Every 12th frame, we get a new toy and all hell breaks loose. Now, one last thing before we finish this video, there's actually one case where this doesn't work, and that is when you have some stuff that is active and is not supposed to be emitted, and one part that is supposed to be emitted. So what we have here is a projectile and a couple of bricks building a wall, and we want to constantly emit a new projectile that hits this wall. Now, this is our setup. So currently we just have a single projectile hitting this wall, and of course this projectile is just a sphere packed into a single point with a name attribute, of course, called ball0. Then we add some velocity to it so that it moves, pretty straightforward. And then here we have a couple of bricks colorized and then also packed with a name attribute of bricks. And then we get 162 bricks out of this. So pretty straightforward, nothing special, but we now want to emit this projectile multiple times. So let's just activate our emit RBDs function. And the problem is when we press start now, we can see that our balls are emitted, but suddenly it becomes really slow and something weird is happening. And you might already guess what's going on. We not only emit the projectiles, but also the wall actually. And here is what is happening. The wall is constantly emitted inside of itself. Not a good idea. So how do we solve this? How can we make sure that only the projectile is emitted? Well, there's actually an attribute for this, of course, as usual. And this attribute is an integer and it's called RBD bullet _emit. And then when we set this to 1, that means that this projectile here will be emitted. And let's just copy this. And for our wall here, we set this to 0. And if you look at this, we can see that it actually worked because it's much faster now and it kind of works. Of course, now, even though it's kind of funny, we are emitting the projectile once per frame. But before we fix that, let's quickly look at an alternative to do this. You know, I'm a big fan of understanding the underlying concept. So using the attribute directly is a good practice. But if you want, you could also use the RBD configure, which has that option at the very bottom under emission. There you can just turn it on and off. And of course it does the same thing. Down here you can see. So if you want to work with the RBD configure, it's built in there as well. So let's now quickly finish this. And we finish this by adding a switch, of course, with a modulo function that we just saw. Looks like this. Every 10th frame, I want to emit the projectile. Let's make sure that we have it right. Now currently it's the wrong way around. So let's make sure that the null is the first input. And now we actually get it only on every 10th frame. And if we now look at the result, of course, we get finally what we want. Every 10th frame, we have a new projectile hitting our wall until it falls apart. Okay, so a small thing that can solve a complex problem. The RBD bullet emit attribute makes sure that you can actually control what will be emitted. So yeah, so that's about emitting or spawning geometry in RBD simulations. I hope this was helpful. Thanks very much and see you later. Cheers.